evening, everybody. It's me, Andy Wilson, for The Traveller in the Evening for our podcast, irregular, every now and again podcast. Tonight, I have with me a very special guest. He's an old friend of mine, John Game. John and I met in the Socialist Workers Party back sometime in the 1980s, and we'll drill into that a little bit as the discussion goes on. But I've known him for an awful long time. Okay, we'll tell that story. But what we want to do is, on the basis of our, experience in politics and what's happened since then and before then, and want to talk about the revolutionary left more generally. So I've titled the meeting "Whatever Happened to the Revolutionary Left," and I suppose that in itself needs a little bit of explaining, because I don't know who's listening to this, but could be all sorts of people and with very, very different experiences. But certainly for a whole period of time, for my generation, generations before that, the revolutionary left was a factor in active politics. If you were involved in politics in any way, you'd eventually come across the revolutionary left. And if you were around at all, these were. I mean, we were in the Socialist Workers Party, and by the time I was in it, they were a pretty powerful organisation on the left, albeit it was a declining left, but nevertheless they had a pretty big presence, things like the Anti-Nazi League and so on. But if you look at the revolutionary left today, it looks to me increasingly like a completely busted flush. And the idea is that tonight that would be what John and I tried to drill into a bit, to tell the story of this, the revolutionary left, really since the end, I think, of the Second World War. Not because we have to take that as a definitive cut-off point, but from around that point moving forward, I think is the story we need to tell. It's really the last phase of capital. And I know, John, you talk about ouverism, and I think that tale of the workers' movement from the end of the Second World War is an enormously coherent tale in a way. And we want to tell that, and then to provide the context for how that comes to an end, really, in the 80s. So that's the big picture. So I'll rewind a little bit and just remind you and I how we met and what happened subsequently. Not in too much detail, because we'd be here all night. But I met John. I must have been, was it in '84, John, when we were both.
I think initially, yeah.
Yeah, I know.
And we used to turn up to student committees occasionally.
Well, that's it. That's something I thought we're going to have to explain, actually, a student committee. But the SWP, Socialist Workers Party, had a student wing, still does for all I know. I don't know if are they allowed on campuses anymore, but if they do, I assume it's under the umbrella of what was called SWSS, Socialist Workers Student Society, which was very much under the wing. It was an extension of the SWP, it was the youth wing of the SWP. And it had a national organisation that was run by the SWP. So there's a national student committee. And John and I, as young, hardly revolutionaries really, but want to be revolutionaries, met on the students, on the sort of national committee of the students, the SWSS. Group, yeah. And that all sounds incredibly tedious, doesn't it? The National Committee of the Swiss.
Well, to make it more exciting, I suspect that a context for both of us, I mean, there were many contexts, but was the miners' strike. And we become involved in that. I was very lucky because I was recruited to the SWP. That wasn't lucky. I was very lucky to be recruited to the SWP in the East London district. Many people will disagree. But one of the things that was lucky about it was that for some reason, there was a concentration of older IS members from the 68 period there who were not, they were loyal comrades, but they were not centre type people. And so I'm 21, 22, and I'm meeting people who, for example, were shop stewards in engineering in the early 1970s. I'm meeting people who were dockers in the early 1970s. And I'm sort of getting this kind of education about the period, we used to call it the upturn, didn't we? When there had been this massive workers' upsurge. And whilst I think the SWP was already sort of degenerating into a Leninist sect by that period, there was still enough people around that you could get a feel for that earlier period. And which I think, and part of my general thesis is that this was the real social basis of the more kind of libertarian Leninism that the old IS claimed to stand for. I think a very problematical concept, but I always think I was lucky to meet those people who kind of educated me, miseducated me as well, but also educated me, brought me into it. And then for those of us who had this sort of romance of the 70s in us, the miners' strike suddenly breaks out. And it's as if everything we talked about was sort of coming true. I mean, of course, that's not quite what happened, but you were connected. And I suspect we were the last generation to get a whiff of that. I suspect succeeding generations didn't.
I was thinking about this recently because I was writing about Mark Fisher, and I didn't, frankly, know that much about him and his generation, But for various reasons, I looked into it. And the more I looked into it, the more obvious it was how big a difference it made. The few years that separated my early political experience from his, and he was at school during the miners' strike. And then he really comes to, becomes politically active, whatever, afterwards. And I think you can really feel that in the work of those people. I think there's a huge generational gap goes on either side of the miners' strike. So I just want to wade in with that, that the miners' strike was absolutely the context with the really meant everything. I mean, I joined during the miners' strike. I joined the SWP. And I was saying to someone only earlier this week that, I can go on for a long time with my criticisms of the SWP, and no doubt I'll do quite a bit of that tonight. But nevertheless, when I was at York University in 1984, the miners' strike, really joining the SWP was how you supported the miners, really, because the SWP were very, very active on the campus that I was on, which was quite isolated from the town. You ended up spending a lot of time there, but as soon as the miners' strike kicked off, I wanted to support it. I was in the anarchist group, and the anarchist group completely fluffed the issue. They wouldn't support the miners on the grounds that they dug coal, and coal's bad for the environment, which is all very true, but nevertheless, whatever, how do we support the miners? And the people doing that with the SWP, so I was immensely attracted to them. But the comparison I wanted to make was with what you were saying about meeting older comrades from an older IS tradition in East London. There was none of that in York. We were a completely isolated branch, and that was a very different situation, but it played hugely to our advantage. I spent the next 2.5 years there, very active in that branch, going out from there to Pontefract to work with miners after the end of the strike, things like that. And I had a pretty fantastic experience of the SWP in York, because the national SWP just didn't, they just left us alone. And we were quite a successful group. We led a lot of occupations and things, so everybody liked us at that level. So they let us go our own way. And what I'm trying to say is we built our own imaginary libertarian SWP in our heads, and that's really what we did in our branch. It was very disjunct from the national SWP. That's obvious now, but we didn't know that.
Well, I mean, it's a very different experience, but in some ways similar, in the sense that what I've described, the older IS comrades being there, they were respected. They'd obviously been loyal to the centre during the various, we can get onto that, faction fights of the 70s and all of that. But, and we'll get onto this as well, there's a particular whiff that stays with people when they've been through particular historical periods, I think. And so the centre was always a bit worried about them. at the same time as they were seen to be loyal. So I had the sort of confusing experience of these people were giants to me, and yet, the organizer would take you to one side and say, look, you can't listen to these people, too much, And so, there was a sort of, but it was interesting when the miners' strike started, it was that layer of comrades who knew exactly who to go to, who to see. And, I learned a little bit about some of the bitterness that persisted after the defeats of the 70s between that generation, between the SWP and others, because it kind of became obvious. But I suppose the thing to stress about that period is whatever the cynicism now, for people of our generation, these were inspiring events, I can actually, to give the CC credit, I can remember one cadre who got up at a student meeting and said of us, actually, that we've been leading 4 occupations in the last year and we were all too tired to do anything, and being told by the CC that we should jump out of the fucking window if we didn't understand that we had to move now. And you can imagine who the comrade was who said that. But, yeah, sorry, I'm waffling. But, I do think it's important to understand, and you stressed this, that the sort of transformative impact of that on our generation and the way that, you saw, in some ways, it's very sad to think about because we thought we were watching the rebirth of something new. What we were actually watching was the destruction of the remnants of, that historical moment, but we didn't realize it at the time.
It's odd because that's the beginning of my not that long, but my career as a revolutionary begins with the miners' strike, and it really does coincide with the end of the revolutionary movement. But one thing that you and I discussed before the meeting was that the sort of the dialectic here between our experience in the SWP and our experience of the wider left, and I think I wanted to say that I'm happy to tell a very SWP-sided story because that's where I saw things from, but it's the story of the whole of the far left. I was the SWP's organiser in Liverpool just after the time that the militant had, run the council and so on. So there was our relationship with the militant was obviously absolutely fundamental there, but it was a huge issue, and I could talk about them for hours and terrible things about them, but they would have the opposite stories to tell about us, and I think we both wanted to make sure that we pulled back from the SWP picture in order to tell that sort of wider tale of the revolutionary left. And in that regard, one thing I wanted to say was that as a kind of communist, anarchist who kind of was drawn towards, the SWP, I was not at all drawn towards Trotskyism. The shallow bit of reading I'd ever done had not led me to be very favourable towards Marxism even, but Trotskyism not. And anybody who had anything good to say about Russia, I can hear tankies curling at the toes now. Saying what a terrible, pro-American, whatever. But I just was sick of the idea of lefties, of which I knew because I'd been politically active in the anarchist movement around various things. But lefties keep, telling me about the progressive nature of Russia, and I just wasn't having it. So when I joined the SWP, it was about the theory of state capitalism, which I'm not even going to describe tonight, but maybe we'll touch on it later. But the point about it was that it drew a clear line between a certain idea of Marxism and actually existing so-called socialism. And I lay that down as a bit of a marker because that wasn't just, that biographical detail just becomes incredibly important for me because the SWP was always in my mind this libertarian. I knew they inherited this libertarianism, well, whatever you want to call it, of the old IS, the International Socialists. But to me, that's what it was about. Obviously, I couldn't see how much they'd already kind of degenerated since that time. But that's fine. All things are relative. But I was giving it my best shot. But that was the idea I had in mind.
And of course, all of this coincides with Solidarnosc in Poland, which becomes, we were one of the few sections of the left who actually celebrated Solidarnosc. And I know comrades who are familiar with the SWP will have heard of Colin Barker's book, Festival of the Oppressed. There are a number of publications, and I mean, the divisions were, I think, already there a little bit. And so a story I always like to tell about this period is we're sitting in a bar in East London again, and two Polish plumbers come in who happen to be anarchists, but they come in and we have this kind of, it's an old joke. It was a brilliant example of explaining the theory of state capitalism to Polish people, which I always think is a rather comical thing. But, there was an atmosphere of solidarity. I mean, they tried to shock us. One of them said that the difference between Poland and Britain, and this is the height of Thatcherism, remember, is that class divisions are much more obvious in Poland, they were saying. And I think this is one thing, people who don't come from Europe, one of the reasons why the left had to engage with those issues a bit more is that we're closer to it. And there actually were, workers coming across from Eastern Europe, despite the prohibitions on travel, the Polish economy had connections to the Western economy, people could travel. But, we were having actually a great discussion, and having a few drinks didn't hurt, and, making all kinds of comparisons between workers in Britain and workers in Poland. And suddenly this comrade walks up and says, of course, the one thing you have to understand is the need for the Leninist Revolutionary Party. At which point these two blokes just got up and walked off. That was the end of that. And so, but what was interesting was that the response of the cadre was, that bloke was a stupid hack. You weren't supposed to say things like that. And on a more serious kind of note, there was if we get to, because you raised the question of libertarianism, that sort of thing, I think there is objectively, quite aside from the SWP, a real ouverist moment in post-war politics, which links the struggles that go on in Eastern Europe and the struggles that go in Western Europe, both of them occurring in systems which are quite different to each other, but reflecting the fact that there is a massive industrialization that's gone on, a new layer of often young people moving into factories and workplaces who are not really, they have a certain distance from the older left of the, in Poland, a very big difference, a big distance. But, in the West, there's a kind of a distance between this younger generation and the older generation of militants. And they sort of do their own thing. And, those connections are kind of what makes the politics possible, really, I think. I mean, I think the attempt to combine Leninism and that kind of sensibility was a complete mistake. That happens to be my opinion, but there was an objective basis for it.
But the objective basis was the growing economy, the post-war boom. I mean, that's why, it strikes me that I joined a movement that identified with that, what you called an ouverist moment, right? This rising tide of workers' confidence, rising overall over a period of decades, along with the boom, right? So you've got the social democratic left, the creation of the welfare state, there's that story happening. But there's the story of the old revolutionary left who picked themselves up after the Second World War, and in a sense, certainly initially, carry on with exactly the same perspectives. But the odd thing was their perspectives didn't change that much, but it was a rising tide. So they could feel very successful, because they're going with the grain, even though their ideas, with hindsight, are a bit batty. I mean, for me, that is an inspiring time, because whatever the downside of it was. It's a time of increasing workers' autonomy, workers, the counterculture and things like that are all part of the picture for me. So it's a fantastic time, and I think one thing it does do is outside of within the shell of the old, what we'd say the far left, the revolutionary left of social democratic left, whatever you want, whatever that is, left of the Communist Party. With all the ideology inherited, to me, there was also attempts to break out of that ideology, and I count the old IS, the International Socialists, forerunners of the SWP, as among those who were trying to, in some way, to batter their way outside of the shell of what was existing. So people like Mike Kidron and Nigel Harris and people like that here. But I think also in parallel in France, there were. But I don't want to go into the details of it. I'm saying it's exciting.
Well, you could also say the autonomists in Italy, the early period autonomists, who do these studies of workplace organisations, and again, young layers of workers clashing with the old society, clashing with the old values, etc. So, I think that's a huge part of what happens. And of course, the way I always think about it is that you have an ideology which actually comes from a period of massive capitalist crisis, of war, of immiseration, really, recession and everything like this, suddenly put on a stage where what the historical period for me after the 50s was a period of enormous expansion of capitalism, and also importantly a period of enormous reforms, social reforms, cultural, sexual, everything you can possibly imagine. And much of the radicalism of the period, I would argue, and actually this is something to reflect sadly on in our present, which we may come on to, much of the radicalism of the period comes from the fact that many people felt they were moving socially, in a good way, but it wasn't enough. And they could also look at places like Northern Ireland, or they could look at the South in America, or, in Italy, people would look at what was happening to the poorest peasants, etc., and there was a sense of outrage about that. Because of the rest of society, the official ideology was we're moving away from all that, but actually there were these dark, spots, if you like, which of course were more than spots. But, that's actually what gave this enormous confidence. But one of the things that always kind of puzzles me is how that, because you can go through the story of just, say if we're talking about the SWP, Socialist Review Group, Cliff has this quite interesting theory, state capitalism, but essentially at that stage, I think they were trots with an odd theory about the Soviet Union, actually. Then Kidron and Harris come along and they start to look again, and funnily enough, one of the things that distinguishes them from the trot left is they do read academic stuff. They do integrate their view of the world with the latest scholarship, all of that. They're not stuck in some Marxist ghetto at all. They're looking more broadly. And they have this idea that, society has fundamentally changed. And that's how, we attract, again, it will be obscure for many people, but very interesting intellectuals like Macintyre and others, who actually writes an article saying, which apparently annoyed the Cliff and people, saying, actually, it's really not true that capitalism can't adapt. Capitalism always adapts. And, one of the things about post-war capitalism, he believed, wrongly in some ways, rightly in others, that, they've solved this problem of inevitable crisis. They'll always be able to get out of it now, he said. And so there's this sense in which radicalism becomes a critique of the limits, which were very real, of liberal modernity, essentially. And so there's this sense of a world which you're part of, but which isn't good enough. And what's extraordinary to me is the depth of the radicalism of the period. There's some people who will sneer at this. So Tony Yunt, whose book on Europe I rate highly in many ways, has this very sneering, you've never had it so good attitude towards 60s radicals, where he basically sees them as spoilt brats. I look at that very differently. I think it's very interesting. I mean, of course, there are excesses and crazy stuff going on, but it's very interesting that once the doors start to open, there's people who want to rush through, there's people who want to take it further. But that's, very much, how I see it. And the old order, when we say the old order was shaking, my view would be, and perhaps I'm leaping ahead too quickly, it wasn't really capitalism that was shaking. It was the old elites that were shaking, the older systems of repression which existed, and that's why you have philosophers like Foucault appearing for all their faults. That's why you have this enormous focus on lifestyle. And interestingly, this isn't just something middle class people are talking about. These movements are, around, there's groups which for the first time seem to transcend class, youth movements, etc. There's a whole new world of politics kind of opening up. And when I said that I was puzzled, you then get people saying, well, what should we do to try and capture all this? And people say, I know, let's become Leninists. I've always thought this is the moment when it all went wrong. So anyway, yeah.
One thing about that you were saying how they kind of ran with it. They got to extend it. They've been getting these gains, which were sort of economically driven. There's expansion within the economy. There's more opportunities. There's a demand for labour. There's all the inevitable consequences of that. One reason I think people, if you like, connected the dots and then were happy to project them into the future and see where they might go, was actually something about, I don't know how specific your ouverism is to this particular period, but one thing about the labour movement was just a long history of utopian, stories about how, there's this much bigger picture. It's not just about the bread and butter or whatever it is, however you want to describe that. And I was thinking about the communist historians group and the way that they, looked back at people like Blake and the Ranters and the Chartists, and then I was reading a criticism of them which says that sometimes, they kind of exaggerated or fantasized about the connections between these old groups and the groups of today. But of course, the correct riposte to that is that the continuity is there in the imagination, that they picked up on that tradition and they remade it. And one of the things that's really noticeable about the left of the 60s and the counterculture is the massive presence of that utopianism. I'm interested in William Blake and whatnot, but that kind of vibe becomes the thing. And I think that is a long-term inheritance of the labour movement, something that can be lost, in other words. That's why I'm mentioning it.
Yeah, so you're saying that the kind of older utopian moment in the Labour left, which had probably been lost in the 20s and 30s, comes back during that period.
Well, I think there's a structure, it's clearly there. And all I'm saying is that it helps explain why people would project beyond merely just, getting a pay rise and getting some better opportunities. They began to dream of a better world. Well, partly there's a kind of continuity of the imagination in the labour movement. And so I just wanted to throw that in there because, whatever my criticisms of the far left and what they did tactically or whatever else, often they were overlapping with those kind of countercultural movements that were breathing utopian ideas back into, the left.
Let us not forget, comrade, that Ian Birchall disapproved of the Beatles after Please Please Me.
It's very good to hear about his opinion.
Previously they were a proletarian dance band, and now they've become these dreadful kind of hippie types, which, God love Ian Birchall, but I think he couldn't have been more wrong about the trajectory of stuff that was going on. I always remember, I talked about East London, meeting, again, various old timers from that period. And I remember being stunned to discover he'd been I'm not going to mention names because it's not fair, but this particular person had been a mod in the 60s, but was listening to not just what the mods listened to, Stax and Motown, but also the Velvet Underground and Sergeant Pepper's and, you know, Jimi Hendrix and a kind of range, and also getting into jazz. And he was someone who came from a family of dockers, you know. So, you know, this was an incredibly kind of culturally vibrant kind of period. And, you know, about, you know, because we were talking about Eastern Europe as well, they were of course banning Beatles records and stuff, which, you know, you were saying about why you never could have become a trot or a people disbelieve we weren't trots. Actually, it's another discussion. But, you know, I mean, I come from family, many of whom had experience of Eastern Europe, and you know, I could never, there was just no way. And maybe that's also been my reaction to Ukraine. But, you know, one story I wanted to get in about those East London old timers, this fantastic guy who, as I said, had taught me so much and, you know, did some of the funniest impressions of Stalinist bureaucrats I've ever heard. The SWP used to hold these educationals where you were taught, you know, how to respond in a meeting where the Communist Party showed up. We hated them. I mean, like, that's almost impossible for people to imagine now, but we hated them. And he did this impression, and I can still remember how he swung his hands as he did it, where this tedious old bastard gets up and says, and I want to, before we move on to other business, I want to discuss our tremendously successful trip to Czechoslovakia, where we were entertained by the comrades and really saw what it looked like when the workers were in the saddle. And the point of the lesson was we weren't supposed to get up and denounce him, because if you denounced him every time he said something like that, you'd never get on to the business. But he was attacked bitterly by some of the more senior comrades present, because this is no laughing matter, comrades, you know, like, because he'd made us laugh too much. But the reason I mention it is when the invasion of Ukraine happens, I'm looking at his Facebook page, since all the business with, you know, we'll cut our ties with the SWP when the Martin Smith stuff happened. I've obviously not been in communication with any of these people, but I looked at his page and he posted this map of Ukraine, which was part of Putinist propaganda, which tried to say Ukraine had never really been a nation anyway. This is as the tanks are rolling into Ukraine. And I saw this and I thought, what the fuck has happened to you? How could you possibly post something like that? You know, and I suppose, you know, that's a great puzzle for me, is how these people who came out of that tradition, all the kind of more inspiring things we're talking about, how could they turn around and start celebrating almost Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
This is the premise of the title of the meeting, is that, you know, whatever happened to them, something ended. And what ended was, for whatever the faults, okay, the for example, the support of solidarity, but whatever it was, the kind of point of departure was that, you know, we supported the sort of working class, however conceived. We didn't get involved in international power politics. It's not, you know, it's not our game or something like that. No matter what the mistakes, that was generally the approach. But the instincts to do that all seem to have completely gone. It's what you were saying about your old friend here. So what happened to that attitude? And you're saying, you asked rhetorically, you know, whatever happened to you? But that's what we're really here to try to explain. So what do you think did happen to them to cross that line? Because it is a line, you know, and if you look at it from the outside, I'm someone who, I've mentioned this a few times in these podcasts, but I was expelled from the SWP after being in it for, God knows, I'd only been in it about a decade, actually. Yeah, something like that. But I was expelled because I was sort of, oh God, it's too boring and annoying to get into, but it was bullshit. It was kind of nonsense. So I was kind of way out of that. You know, I hadn't been involved in the SWP since I was expelled in 1994. I've had no formal. In fact, I was banned for life from any of their meetings. So you can bet I've had very little kind of overlap with them. But nevertheless, speaking, that means that, you know, I know something of what makes them tick, right? You know, it's very difficult. From the outside, it's really obvious. If you know something of what was supposed to make them tick, it's very obvious the difference in attitude. The way that they now sort of tail end the Communist Party and things like that. That was inconceivable. When I was a member. So, what do you think has changed? Because it is a line was crossed. It's not a difference of tactics we're talking about here. There's a fundamental loss of orientation, not really change of orientation.
These are huge topics, of course. And it's important to say there's different kinds of answers you could give to this question. You could say it's all been bad since Marx, or you could say it's all been bad since the Bolshevik Revolution, or, you could go on like that, and there'll be a bit of truth there. But the truth is, as we've discussed, there was a period when they did not look like that, and then suddenly they look like that. And I think, in a way, it's connected to the decline of that ouverist moment, actually. And one way of looking at this, because we talked about Solidarnosc and those things, is that from 1956 onwards, you see rebellion after rebellion in Eastern Europe. And in each case, the working class was central. But actually, by the time you reach the 1980s, it's become clear that dissidence in Eastern Europe, in a popular sense, is nobody's talking about socialism with a human face. Gorbachev, maybe. But as soon as, the repression lifts, people just don't want to hear this fucking language anymore. Now, that's a debate about, what goes on inside those countries. But the way this is reflected on the left here is, I can remember when the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, we held loads of meetings saying, yay, the Berlin Wall's come down, isn't this great? Of course, what was also happening was that it was becoming clear that the East German left, who had been dissidents, were completely marginal to the movement as a whole. And that kind of old, if you like, trot fantasy about you take away Stalinism and then there'll be a workers' revolt was simply not happening. People actually wanted the same things. It's easy to make fun of people who just like bread and butter. People did want some of the same things that people in the West wanted, which is why I think many on the left have never forgiven the proletariat of Eastern Europe. They wanted washing machines, they wanted, consumer goods, and during the Brezhnev period, you could have a bit, but not too much. And so people wanted it. So what happens is, this also becomes the mood on the rest of the left. Suddenly, at the very moment when supposedly your theory's been vindicated, that actually existing socialism wasn't really socialism, that, it was state capitalism, it becomes clear that the other part of your project, which thought that this would be the moment of the rebirth of a revolutionary socialist project, isn't happening. And so I think it's at that point that, there will be people who disagree. I had a discussion with an ex-CC member recently who said, oh, we were never trailing after the Communist Party in the 90s. And I was thinking, actually, my memories differ a little bit. But I think when the former war in Yugoslavia happened, I think that was a big turning point. Geopolitics had started to displace that notion of popular struggles, which we'd had previously. You have people writing books about we need to find a new revolutionary subject and all of this. The thing with the left in the 50s and 60s, we thought we knew who the revolutionary subject was. It was there. You didn't have to kind of write books looking for it. If you think of Colin Barker's old book, Revolutionary Rehearsals, there was no question in the 70s that the organised working class played a huge role in the biggest upheavals of that period. That simply doesn't happen afterwards. And one of the things I increasingly think is it doesn't really matter what theory you have. If your politics don't fit reality, and this is, of course, what happened to the Trots after the Second World War, if it doesn't fit reality, it's just going to start to come unglued. And I think you may or may not remember all of this talk of revolutionary regroupment and various kinds of unity projects which people were engaged in. Tremendous excitement about the fact that we'd united with a bunch of fucking Stalinists to prevent humanitarian intervention in the former Yugoslavia. Contrast that with the kinds of things that we were involved in the 60s and 70s. And I think that's when the SWP and ICE tradition were always a bit like this, partly because of a kind of rather boisterous workerism, ouverism. But the bandwagon jumping tendency just gets completely out of hand at that point. And it becomes de rigueur. Anything that happens must be progressive, and you just follow along behind it. And I think that led us into some rather dark places. I mean, just before I forget, the way I sometimes formulate this when my thoughts are more organized is from ouverism to workerism. From that period that we talked about to a fucking celebration of Brexit. I mean, that's the trajectory. That's what's going on, I think.
I mean, I really have no idea who our audience would be on this or what the mix will be, but some people will want an explanation of what this distinction is between ouverism and workerism. So, however you want, however you want to do it. No, it's a good joke. I get it, but I want to, because there's the whole Italian thing, gets into the mix here. But I want to say that to me, what I'm talking about with ouverism is just the confidence of the workers' movement as it emerged after the end of the Second World War, based on the long boom, based on the growing economy. And all of those things, right, created a weird admixture of, the confidence that flows from that, growing self-confidence, growing organisation, but also not a reversion, but a kind of harking back to old ways of thinking, traditional ideas, and the labour movement about communism. So we're all going to be going down that path, and that's not what happened, but there was the overshoot is massive, actually, when you think about it. Given what we were saying about the miners' strike, and having lived through it and then lived through the period after it, the difference. I didn't know what was going on exactly immediately before the miners' strike. I was going to college, I guess, after 7 years in the military, right? But after the miners' strike, it was very different. I mean, I remember Pat Stack actually was mentioned yesterday on Facebook about the poll tax riots, and I remember them fondly, which is after the miners' strike. But they didn't seem to mean something in the sense that I remember people, all around the world were excited to see Thatcherism getting one in the eye. It felt like something, So there's been those things since then, but the degeneration since then seems to be total now. So. We can drill down into more detail, but I'm always keen to kind of push back and look at the sort of wider picture, and then we can sort of maybe we'll oscillate between the two or something. But I wanted to try and get you to reflect more generally, because we've spoken so much about the SWP. We've talked about how we felt it was different in some way, but we've also tried to say it was very much part of this wider left. You can't having your cake and eating it, really. So I want to say I don't see any. Whereas when I joined the SWP, I thought I was joining something distinctly non-Trotskyist, right? Distinctly libertarian. I remember sitting on the steps of, I think it was SOAS, anyway, a college somewhere in London, for some student Marxism type event, and I was sat on the steps with Tony Cliff. And I said to him, this Trotsky, us and Trotskyism. I said, we're not Trotskyists, are we? And he said, no, we're not Trotskyists. He said, but we will be. When we've defeated the Trotskyists, we will just pick up the Trotsky mantle. And at the time,
we're the Trotskyists now.
I think that became much more open later on. At the time he said that to me, that was a controversial opinion. And I thought at the time I really didn't like what I was hearing at all from him. Right, I was not at all happy with that. So I was very struck. I guess it's a while ago now, but it was 10 years ago now, I guess. But it was a good while later. I was very struck that I was criticising Trotskyism. I was making fun of orthodox Trotskyism in some discussion online, and an SWP member came wading into me, denouncing me. How could I criticise Trotskyism, right? Because, and when I said to him, but you're an SWP member, right? And there was actually a little bit of confusion because I assumed that he wouldn't be a Trotskyist, right? But he took from the fact that he was an SWP member that he was absolutely a Trotskyist. So I got a sense of some phase change had taken place. Definitely that idea had bedded in. That they'd inherited that mantle. But my point about that was that they have become just like the other Trotskyists, and that allows us to speak of the other Trotskyists and the far left in general. Because I think that, is it too much to expect you to talk maybe a little about the crisis of Marxism, what they had in common? And I'm not talking about academic Marxism, but the kind of Marxist perspective, Marxist activist perspective in the Western world as it emerged, after the last World War. That's been part of the downfall, really.
I mean, just to preface my remarks by saying one of the really odd things, not about the SWP, not even about the Trots, but kind of about the left in general at the moment, is that whenever you come to you'll get people who are quite good on various questions, on Ukraine, say, or on Syria, and we haven't covered all of this, The problem comes when they come to what I call the pedagogical moment, where they talk about what their solution is. And it's always just like this kind of like weird thing tagged on the end, which actually has very little to do with what's, preceded it. And you just get this sense that, there's a kind of irrelevance. I mean, how to begin in general. I mean, I was going to say something about this quite interesting Italian socialist who was writing in the 1920s. And it harks back to a little bit to our discussion of the 1950s and 1960s, actually. Because one of his central argument is that the tragedy of the Italian left during that period, which obviously saw the rise of fascism later and all of this, was that the best and most militant people described themselves as Marxists. But actually, despite what Marx said, the traditions that they represented were the old 19th century conspiratorial underground forms of radicalism, whilst the people they called revisionists and opportunists were actually people who were much more in tune with the developing mass democratic currents of the working class. But very unfortunately, the people who were leading the mass democratic currents were guilty. They had a guilty conscience about not being Marxists. So instead of saying, actually, I think we need to break with all this, they said, actually, no, we are Marxists. The way he puts it is that young people, of course, could see straight through this, and it just made them look dishonest. And that meant that people who were, and even in our tradition, we know about them, Bordiga and the maximalists. I mean, people who are arguing I know you probably have a bit of affection for Bordiga, but people who are arguing complete dangerous bollocks would actually get a better hearing from young militant people than people who were arguing reasonable things but were confused about where they stood. And sorry, this isn't what you asked at all, but I often think that's our problem, that we know this is all bollocks, but we don't quite know what to replace it with. And so these people just carry on, what's Higgins, the more years for the locust will just sort of like suck people up because nobody really has the bottle to say, actually, we were defeated. That idea was defeated. We need to think again about what radicalism means. And we need to, ditch all this stuff. And speaking, I'm not talking about the Second World War or anything I said I was going to speak, but I think more broadly, when you were asking what went wrong in the 90s and stuff, I don't think it's really a tale about the SWP at all. I think it's a tale about the radical left in general, and it's not even about just the Trots. I think neoliberalism was like a gift for us, because once it became apparent that there was quite a cultural mood against neoliberalism, it enabled us to revive the old songs, even if the social content was just entirely different. That's what I find so interesting about this guy Rossellini, because that's essentially his argument. And when you look at, because I was rereading, what's that book called by Susan, American liberal left, Shock Doctrine, wrote the Shock Doctrine, do you know the book? Naomi Wolf, is it? Shock. Yeah. But essentially arguing that capitalism now is just as, it's completely untrammeled, but arguing that its headquarters is the US, which seemed to make sense at the time because, the Gulf War had happened and all of that stuff, that their first victim had been the Soviet Union. This is not somebody who comes from any kind of Stalinist tradition, but is arguing this. And you get this picture of neoliberalism as this vast American project, and there's loads of popular culture about it and stuff. And I think in all sorts of ways, much of that wasn't really true. Looking back at the period, there were all sorts of interesting newer forms of radical politics that were being born. I think in a lot of ways, things really go off kilter when Bush launches the war on terror, because at that point, the old tunes become overwhelming and we stop looking at reality, basically. And, Putin and what's happened since is, I suppose, a kind of revenge of history, and that's why so much of the left can't see anything in what's going on aside from American imperialism doing it and the whole picture of geopolitics. I'm sorry, I've not answered your particular question, but I just, that was something it's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, because it leaves out, completely the way in which in other parts of the world, globalization, it does see a lot of immiseration. It also sees massive economic growth. It sees the emergence of new kinds of political forces, some of them progressive, most of them extremely reactionary. Almost none of them are the pawns of America in any meaningful sense. This is a new world that's actually being created. And so I'm going to bang on about one of my old obsessions. It's a weird kind of Eurocentrism, actually. Maybe one of the things that happened with globalization was that capitalist modernity becomes a truly universal thing, but we're still trapped in European stories. And so nothing that happens outside of Europe or North America really registers with us until it suddenly comes and hits us. And there's, it's still on the left here, this weird nostalgia for, the great anti-colonial movements of the 50s and 60s. And of course, they were great movements. But it's also true that history has moved on, and a lot of the states that were created out of that turned into fucking nightmares, And the idea that what you're going to do is, celebrate this now, it might go down well on a Western campus. In large parts of the world, it's just the official ideology of the ruling class. It's quite an odd thing. Sorry, I've bundled too much together. But to be fair, the question we're asking is a very large one. I do think there's a sense now in which the post-68 left is now completely dead, just in general.
I think that's the one I wanted to get a grip on, and it's obviously going to be impossible to do definitively. We're too close to the events, but I really have this sense that a line is crossed, that something is over, and it's very hard to think about except in terms of, the failures of the left, but that's not the real story, whatever the many failures were, there's also been a moving target, and nobody noticed that the target had moved on. We're still way behind, in terms of thinking where the enemy was aligned and that kind of thing. And I think people were just singing from the old hymn sheet because, it hadn't got them into trouble so far or something like that, Well, there's another thing, and there's something else you said which was about, I think it was the Italian guys who were really, doing some rethinking, but didn't want to say that they weren't Marxist anymore. Well, it was hard to revision completely. It's hard to start all over again. And not only in the obvious sense intellectually, but but also of where you get to speak and who you talk to and what conferences you go to, and just practically speaking, it's very difficult to break out of that. So I'm making an excuse for it, but there's a lot to it anyway. But the same question occurred. I want to say as well. Well, what's the difference between? We do need to move on. We do definitively need to move on, is my belief, because the target has moved, okay? So the ways that we used to do things is now completely redundant. But of course, the difficult bit is the next bit, what is to be done? I'm sorry to borrow a phrase, but what is to be done? And I think you and I have very, very different ideas about that. But I wouldn't mind if you talked about, your own ideas about that, what needs to be done. I think, actually, for the benefit of a couple of people who have asked me about this, what you and I have in common right now is a concern to defend what you might call the centre, what used to be called the centre in politics, against the onslaught from the right. But the question is, why are we doing that? Okay, not hard to justify, but nevertheless, what is the big picture here? And I think we probably have a different big picture. But I'm inviting you anyway to talk about why, how you see that change of focus for you from a Marxist, however, kind of perspective to a very different perspective you have now.
Well, I mean, I am at the moment trying to write a book called In Defense of Liberal Modernity, so you see what a fucking heretic I am. But I'm first of all, there's the shared ground, which I'm sure we do share, which is, if you like, just a negative reaction, is I cannot watch as authoritarians and populists tear apart basic rights and large sections of the left go, "Oh, I told you so." Instead of being at the forefront of the movement against these things, they're actually at best neutral. And actually quite proud of it, So we say, well, Ukraine is an intra-imperialist conflict, so, we're not even going to take sides. And then they just repeat the kind of guff that, Putin is coming out with. There's all of that sort of thing. The stuff with Brexit was utterly disgusting to me because it's simply, what was it you were saying that a friend of yours said that they had a kind of cheeky plebeian quality?
I can't remember, but it was a muscular proletarian ideology or something, but he used muscular.
Yeah, muscular. Yeah. And so, it's at one level, because I do believe in the united front. I mean, I do actually think there is a need to actually not be embarrassed about uniting with liberals. I mean, at the moment, it's absolutely crazy as Trump is ripping through every kind of constitutional safeguard, that people really think the main thing they should be doing is bashing liberals. I just can't even comprehend, that kind of mindset. And so I would argue the negative case is fairly easy. I mean, it's fairly obvious that we're now going to be moving out of the old neoliberal world into a world where, I mean, I was writing earlier today, a world which reflects a kind of old-fashioned imperialist carve-up where the big powers decide what goes and the little powers, just get fucked. And interestingly, the main target of these people for the first time in the post-war world, I think, is actually Europe. I mean, I think that's what's been one of the most extraordinary things. We're seeing Vance and his stormtroopers, attacking liberal democracy in Europe, openly allying with the far right. This hasn't happened since 1945, anything like this. And so I think the negative case is fairly straightforward, actually. Whatever the hypocrisies, whatever the limitations, you have to know what side you're on. And, unfortunately, most of the left doesn't. And they're not and they get so tied up in trying to emphasise that they're not siding with liberals that they end up being in danger of actually siding with the right. The much more complicated question, of course, is what form of politics should you adopt? Because actually, ultimately, the united front isn't really good enough. Now, and much of the last 10 years for me have been agonizingly thinking about this. I mean, I think one of the ways I look at it is that, yes, globalization and that era caused suffering. That's always true with capitalism, isn't it? There's never a situation where society changes and everybody, everything goes well. That's not actually how it happened. It also did open up quite a lot of opportunities, both for radical struggles and actually for many people's living standards. There's a reason why the left has collapsed in, one example would be India. Yes, there is repression, but the older model, they too have ended up following along after neoliberalism, even the left, because you cannot get people to vote for you if you say you want to return to the old way. I mean, I don't want to sound too much like Marxism today. I'm always aware, that this is a danger. But you need to have a politics, for me, which is basically to be the backbone of the centrists. That's how I describe it. What I dislike about Starmer isn't that he's adopting neoliberal policies. It's that he's completely indecisive. He's as indecisive as we are, let's put it that way. He is simply trying to keep the far right off his back by going along with populist nonsense, proving that he's not, somebody who threatens, the stability of society, etc. It's as if he still thinks he's fighting Corbyn. It's really weird. Now many people would say, yes, what we want is Corbyn. I wouldn't actually, because I just don't understand. Sorry, I'm getting incoherent. I don't understand what the point is of having a radical form of politics whose program is essentially to have a compromised version of the late 70s. I just, I don't think that's I don't think that's possible anymore. What I would want is somebody who, for example, took the idea of, what's it called, universal benefits? It's your industry, UBI, quite radical proposals about how to make things better for people, which were compatible with the kind of economies that we actually have. But to be the radical edge of that, to be more concerned about equality, to be more, to be properly social democratic. In terms of, I'm being very incoherent, partly because it's incredibly difficult. The negative case is easy. The positive case is not, because we don't know yet what the direction of, we don't even know, to be honest, if we're still going to be living in liberal democracies in 10 years. We don't know. Anyway, I'll leave you probe me further or rebut me, or, I'll have a drink of water.
I think we're at such a completely different point in history. I think the question of what ought we to do next? What is the big picture? What's the correct politics in the widest sense? I certainly feel completely unprepared to even begin to answer it. At the same time, I don't.
Well, thanks a lot for that.
I feel very differently, I think, about it than you do. I think there's in a sense, a much bigger problem here, because I'm all for this defending the centre, and I can see it was certainly my first reaction when what started to happen, right? When it was obvious that you were seeing a fascist, turn against the centre. I was all for defending it, but at the same time, I'm aware that centre's time is passing. I don't think there is a future for it. I don't think we're facing a a sort of, an equal slugging it out between liberal democracy and fascism. I think something else has to be on the agenda, not because it's unfashionable or something, but it's because it's that. I suppose what another way to look at it is like that. I can't remember the author's name, but the piece we both read recently about the sort of withering away of the relevance of the nation state, the old way of doing things, right? The old implied contract between the masses and the elites, those who own the wealth, that with the state mediating between them in a sense, and there's some sort of agreement to look after one another. We will give them reform so they don't give us revolution, but it was a mutually agreed pact kind of thing. That's the polity that we have in fact lived in for a long time now. But increasingly, the elites can see themselves as some standing above that system because they can move their capital around, things like that. And I think that's what we're seeing in the States is the elites saying, do you know what, the only bit of the state we're interested in is the repressive apparatus, really, stuff like that. The old contract between us and the populace is gone, fuck you. And that's such a challenge to our way of even thinking about politics. You spoke about Corbyn, but Corbyn's entire mindset is the mindset of the Communist Party after the Second World War in Britain. It's the British road to socialism, right? We stay out of Europe because we don't want Johnny Foreigner interfering with our state, which we will use to introduce socialism in this country.
We are great opponents of empire, but what about the communists?
But that's the entire politics, and so that to me that world has gone, and so I'm very much for defending the centre, but I'm also very conscious that the centre was the centre of a kind of stood on the centre of a landmass that existed, but the landmass that it was the centre of is slipping away, is my feeling. And what comes after that, I don't know, but that's such a big question, obviously.
I heard someone say something quite interesting recently, which was they were discussing the decline of the Roman Empire. And the question was raised, why did the Roman Empire collapse in the West before it collapsed in the East? And the argument was because it was more wealthy. And what that meant was that the private wealthy classes felt they didn't need the state anymore. So they built private armies. They refused to pay their taxes, refused to, because they just felt they were wrong, of course, but, they felt that they didn't need it. I mean, and certainly you can see the parallel that's being drawn with the Musks and, these people. But I am not really, because you talked about, because capital can move everywhere, you can't, you can't do anything. It's certainly true that you can't have the kind of social democratic project that, marked the post-war years. But there's also this argument from somebody like Snyder. I mean, I don't know if you've come across this, but he talks about Europe. He makes fun of Europe because he says, people always tell these nice stories about Europe that after the war, everyone thought, oh, there's been so much killing. Now we must have peace. And he said, this is just complete rubbish. I mean, if the places where there was most killing, there was no kind of desire at that time to form a union. What it was you had the old empires, France, Britain, etc., who were suddenly faced with the decline of their independent power bases. And you look at the states that held out the longest, they were the ones who hoped that they could maintain a bit of their empire. So France, Britain, Germany realized it was a no-go, West Germany, that is. And so they were keen, And so he describes Europe as a kind of, in a weird way, a post-colonial project. I mean, it's the form of state organization empires adopt after they lose their empire. And so this is also Jung's argument as well. And with all the contradictions, it's also partly what the radicalism was about, the anti-imperialism in the Europe of that time, being against the old kind of powers who were trying to hang on to their empires because it was out of step with the times, etc. And so in that way, I mean, I think, Snyder says the reason why Putin and Trump hate Europe so much, it's because they're against this. They're against a world of states cooperating with each other. And, they want to see a world where only the big powers, the very fact he's talked about invading fucking Canada. And it's like some dystopian sort of science fiction novel. This is not a world of free trade they're proposing. This is at all, and so for me, I suppose I have my own nostalgia mixed with horror, but that period in the 90s, which was in many ways, it was a depressing time if you're on the left. It was also true that, the world was opening up in a kind of strange way. You did have big democracy movements in large parts of the world, which unfortunately the left kind of sneered at rather than jumping on board with. And you also see that, with the attitude towards Ukrainians who wanted to be integrated into something else other than the kind of nightmare Russia world that Putin talks about. And I would want a politics. I don't want a politics which condemns future generations to a rerun of the 20s and 30s. And also when it comes to the environment, and I guess this would be a disagreement between us. One of the things I don't really understand about a lot of the environmental activism, it's not that I don't back it, that I don't, oppose the state repression and all of this, but I cannot imagine any solution which would not involve global institutions, which in a sense in today's world means liberal institutions. I can't imagine any way in which the climate crisis could be addressed without global cooperation. And I therefore cannot imagine any form of politics addressing what's really important for humanity, which did not involve seeking to rebuild those institutions rather than destroy them. Do we have time for a revolution? Because people always say it's, I'm doing my full centrist bit now, Andy. But people always talk about, because the situation is so dire, we have to do something extremely radical. That's true. But unless it involves functioning global institutions, how on earth would anything be addressed? And one of the things I was going to say was that many of us, since about 2013 and before, have spent a lot of our time reading books which questioned the Marxist tradition, which went back to root causes and all of those things and trying to figure things out. And I think the reason why I'm suddenly thinking about liberal modernity is that I got really into just what was wrong with Marxism, which actually, if you go into it, it's not hard to find, stuff which just doesn't work. And that's also why I like that Italian bloke, the way he talks about ideologies as kind of snake skins, which people in different circumstances can wear in different ways. It's very weird. It's like reading a sort of Gramsci's doppelganger or something. He's arguing for a different resolution, but the language is very similar, and the feel is very similar, actually, that there's something deceptive about these official ideologies, because underlying it all is, I guess the old Marxist point, men in real historical circumstances trying to figure stuff out, but the ideology becomes a cloak, rather than something which illuminates. And it's only recently that I've started trying to think, and I was going on about Sweden and ABBA with you the other day, but I was thinking, about, we come from a tradition which treats what for very large sections of humanity was the greatest political disaster they ever experienced, i.e. the October Revolution, as kind of like the high point, that's where you start from. Then you look at post-war Europe, which actually incubates our own politics as well, something which I don't think we've managed to state clearly enough in some ways. And actually, it doesn't look that bad, it really, and one of the things that I find interesting is how many different political positions have been compatible with, so you've got Swedish social democracy, you've got French Gaullism, then you've got, French, you've got British Labour Party, you've got the British Tories. The idea that it is simply impossible, what we took as gospel, that within this framework you couldn't possibly do anything better, has become a recipe for despair, I think. It's become a recipe for, in a weird way, apathy. You listen to popular left podcasts now, and there's this cynicism which they seem to find empowering, but it's actually just a way of saying really nothing can be done, and it becomes an identity to think like that. And I sometimes think, and this is a dark thought, to leave it on, one of our problems is that many of our generation could be quite bright lights on the left, because it wasn't a very bright place. And then when you have to move out into the wider world, suddenly it's a little bit harder. You were saying about you don't have an audience anymore. People are what? If you don't have those people who nod at the most kind of absurd statements of historical reality. We were talking about fascism and Trump. Most historians agree that the great tragedy of the anti-fascist movement in the interwar years was that the left was divided. Left and liberals were divided. That's why the fascists won. We come from a tradition which has all these really clever arguments about how that isn't actually so. Nobody else agrees with us on this, but it's somehow you have to gesture and bow to it. And actually, I've come to the conclusion that these things are mostly just bollocks. That doesn't mean we don't need some kind of radical politics. But when I say rethinking, I do defend the centrists. I don't like centrists, actually. I think one of the things that Rossellini said is there's two ideologies which are dead. And he says one is bourgeois liberalism, by which he meant the liberalism, the pre-social democratic liberalism of his period, and the other is state socialism. Right? These are just dead ideologies. And he then at least had the gumption to try and he was a militant. He ends up being murdered by the fascists in 1938. He founds big anti-fascist organizations in Italy, still remembered. Now, it is a bit of a problem that his inheritors were the Italian Socialist, post-war Socialist Party, didn't do too badly, but it's not exactly something to shine. But I am kind of looking at those thinkers, not with the idea of imitating them, but with the thought we need to have the bottle to actually, think, for example, could you have a system in which there was a market, but you also had socialized, things happening in society? You had a more equal society. What would a political platform, look like? To which some of our friends would say, Tony Blair, but that's not what I'm arguing, But the trouble is we're at the very big, but I'm still fascinated by, the question of what would a progressive politics today look like? Because we might disagree about it, but I don't think either of us have a very clear idea of it, actually. I know what I want to do negatively, but I'm not entirely sure, and obviously there's a danger, Andy, that we remember with such joy our youth. And we did go through some great things, but there's two possibilities, well, two dangers. One is it might not all have been as good as it seemed at the time, and we might be looking with rose-tinted spectacles at some of it. And well, I certainly have done, and I certainly did. And so my disagreement with Junt that I referred to earlier, where he just talks about the 68 students as spoilt brats, I found it highly offensive. So I do still, I want to salvage that sense of human possibility. I just don't think it's where we thought it was. That's the big thing. And I've become very suspicious of final solutions of any kind. This is what I mean by liberal modernity. I don't mean a determinate set of things. I don't believe we will ever live in a society where there aren't problems. And I can't believe I'm saying this because my younger self will kick my head in. But I don't even know if, whenever that's been attempted, the result has been a fucking nightmare, you know, for most people. Anyway, sorry, I'm ranting again.
John, we shall certainly reconvene. I don't know how much territory we covered. I will have to listen to the whole thing again and work, try and divide it into bits or something. But we'll be back for a rematch or something, or to pick up the pieces that we dropped.
I would like that also, because anyway, I enjoyed it very much. Thank you, Andy. And thank you for the hard work you will do trying to find the coherence.
Thank you, John. And to everyone else, remember, it's the Traveller in the Evening podcast. Come and find the Traveller in the Evening and subscribe and all the usual kind of things. And apart from that, do a paid subscription if you can. That would be very, very nice. But apart from that, I'll speak to you again on the next Traveller in the Evening podcast.